Wrapping up election 2022 in Hawaii. A new governor is preparing to take office. Kauai and Maui County voters have chosen their mayors, and the state legislature is getting ready to welcome some new faces. This as voters have their say on a number of county charter amendments. A look ahead at some of the key issues that could be facing lawmakers in 2023 and beyond. Tonight's live broadcast and live stream of insights on PBS Hawaii start now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Yanji Denise. The votes are in and Josh Green will be Hawaii's next governor, but that's not all. There's a new class of first-time lawmakers joining the state legislature as well as the various county councils. Their decisions will shape Hawaii's future and impact our everyday lives. Tonight we're taking a closer look at what issues could be heading to the forefront, plus a recap of the races and a discussion on our historically low voter turnout. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email or call in your questions, and you'll find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and on the PBS Hawaii Facebook page. Now to our guests. Journalist Catherine Cruz is with Hawaii Public Radio. She's the host of The Conversation and a member of HPR's news team. She previously worked as a television reporter for more than 30 years at KITV. Colleen Uechi is the managing editor of the Maui News, which is a daily newspaper that covers issues happening on Maui, Lanai, and Molokai. She grew up on Oahu and interned at the Molokai Dispatch paper before joining the Maui News. Blaze Lovell is a reporter for the online investigative news website Honolulu Civil Beat. Born and raised on Oahu, he's a Pearl City High School graduate and earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And political analyst Colin Moore is an associate professor and the director of the Public Policy Center at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Thank you all for being here. I know we've all been refreshing our browsers, looking at the final printouts. Colin, I want to start with you. Just your overall impressions of what we experienced on Tuesday.
Well, there weren't too many surprises. I mean, Josh Green became governor, or is governor-elect, and that was expected by a huge margin. I think the only big surprise really was that the Republicans did as well as they did. We've talked or joked a little bit about a Hawaii red wave, but all joking aside, they really should be given credit for increasing the number of seats in the House to 6, from 4 to 6, and even more surprising, the number of seats in the state Senate from 1 to 2. And we haven't had 2 Republican state senators since 2008. So this really is a remarkable result for Republicans. I think they invested their money really strategically. Lynn Finnegan, the head of the party, deserves, I think, a lot of credit for these victories. Some of them were a little bit unexpected. We had an incumbent go down. She was running from a slightly different district, but that's even still quite surprising. And another incumbent who ended up winning, this is Maile Shimabukuro in District 22, came within 72 votes of losing her seat. So a really successful result from Republicans.
One thing that may be surprising to folks is just how few people actually voted. We had a historically low vote turnout. Blaze, when you look at how much Josh Green won by, but then contrast that with the, 48% of people who were eligible to vote actually voting, do you feel like this new administration really has a mandate?
This is sort of a question we always have to ask almost every general election, because Hawaii's voter turnout has kind of historically been so low. Since the late 80s, early 90s, voter turnout has been on a steady decline. Obviously in 2020, with the introduction of all-mail voting, we saw a huge spike. But this year it seems like it's sort of settled. Part of that may be because of the dominance of the Democratic Party and the state's top race, the governor's race. In a lot of voters' minds, that might have been decided, at the primary. So I think races is a big part of it. But I guess another thing, we need to consider is that even though looking at the percentage-wise, it was the lowest voter turnout in Hawaii's state history at 48%. You got to sort of also look at the raw number of people who voted, which was over 400,000, and I believe that that's higher than it was in 2018. So you sort of need that context to where we have more people registering to vote. You also have more total people coming out to vote, but the voter participation percentage is still really low for us.
Yeah, well, let's talk about who's going to the fifth floor now. Catherine, we have Josh Green and Sylvia Luke, colleagues in the legislature and now coming together as partners at the Capitol. What do you see as the dynamic between those two?
Well, they've been saying that they're lockstep. They get along great. They talk daily. I just saw Sylvia Luke on the way over here. She was sign waving, mahalo signs down there by Honolulu Hale, by the Capitol. I think it'll be interesting to see, how well they work together. We've had both candidates on our show recently. Josh has said that he wants Sylvia to take a larger role as lieutenant governor. She's going to be looking at, developing those preschools that we've been hearing about. She's also going to be working on broadband. We saw the infrastructure in government just woefully behind, during the pandemic. All the problems with the labor department, the unemployment claims. So those are the two areas that I think she's going to be focusing on, because she brings to the table, obviously, a wealth of experience as a finance chair. And, she said she has her relationships, and we'll see how far that goes.
Yeah, Colleen, I want to get your input here. Of course, Josh Green really touting himself as a neighbor island guy with Kona roots and talking about his work in Kohala as a doctor. Do you think that neighbor island connection helped to play to some of the counties outside of Honolulu?
Definitely, I think that definitely played a role. People like when they see candidates who, can think about the neighbor islands, not too Oahu-centric. And, he did visit Maui a lot during the pandemic. And that was another thing that really helped his visibility in terms of, just getting his name out there across the state, right? He was the guy who was like, look, I'm the medical professional, let me help you guys through this pandemic. And so the visibility statewide, as well as that neighbor island connection and repeated visits to Maui, especially our hospital, I think definitely helped how he fared in Maui County.
Colin, I want you to pick up what Catherine had laid out about the dynamic between Sylvia Luke and Josh Green. Josh Green sort of famously or notably had a lot of dissension with his own governor. He and Ige didn't always get along or see eye to eye on public policy when it came to COVID. What do you expect him to do with that relationship, given that he himself was a self-proclaimed insubordinate lieutenant governor?
I remember that he was even asked this question, how would you react if Sylvia Luke started going rogue? And he said, well, I'd let her. I'm not sure that's actually true, though. I mean, one thing I will say is that this relationship is more important for Josh Green than Sylvia Luke. And what I mean is that Sylvia Luke brings a lot to the table, right? She is a senior legislator. She has a mastery of the state budget process. Josh Green, despite all his strengths in communication, was not, I think, what you would call a really successful legislator when he was a state senator. He wasn't a very powerful member of the state Senate. And Sylvia Luke, of course, was probably the second most powerful member of the House. So if he can work with Sylvia Luke, she can provide a way for him to get his administrative package through the legislature, a place where he doesn't always have a great relationship. So I expect that it's going to start out well, because both of them value this. I think if there's going to be someone who starts to veer a little bit, it's likely to be Sylvia Luke. And I think she's going to probably be thinking, maybe in 2 years, am I going to challenge Josh Green for governor? There's a long history in Hawaii, as you know, of lieutenant governors running against their own governor. And so that may be a dynamic we see. But I think that in the beginning, it's really important for them to stick together, because their honeymoon isn't going to be very long. I mean, we know that Governor Ige has struggled. He hasn't always been as successful a communicator as I think Josh Green will be. But the other thing is that people are just really frustrated with the performance of the state. I mean, Governor Ige has been one of the least popular governors in America for the entirety of his second term. And it's not just because of the mistakes he's made. It's because people are frustrated with state government and they blame the governor. So I expect that Luke and Green are going to have a really short honeymoon, which means they need to stick together and get some early wins on the board if they're going to have a successful administration.
Yeah, and Blaze, what do you think those early wins should be? What should they focus on?
I mean, they'll definitely need it this session coming in early and coming in strong. And they need to deliver on, at least a few of their promises. They've promised, more affordable housing units. They want to oversee how this new $600 million that the legislature gave to the Department of Hawaiian Homelands to, tamp down on that humongous waiting list is going to go. So they've got to execute that. And I think that housing component, because they've talked so much about it, it's really what voters, I think, are going to score them on this legislative session. And to echo what Colin said, the governor-elect is definitely going to have to lean on the new lieutenant governor, Sylvia Luke, to get him through the session. The Senate, in particular, has changed a lot since he was there. He used to be part of a coalition that, included Governor Ige and a few other powerful senators, but that faction is completely gone. It's totally new leaders from when he was last in that building, and he's going to need, some allies, and that ally is going to be right across the walkway on that 5th floor.
Yeah, Catherine, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree that he needs her more than she needs him?
Probably, yeah. It'd be interesting to see, what happens as the governor starts to assemble his cabinet. He did say that he may keep some of the IGE, administrators. So, they are looking for people to throw in their resumes. They have already talked to some people to see who's interested. So it'd be kind of curious to see how that all plays out.
Right, and December 5th will be here before we know it, and you're talking about the head of DBED who, under the way things are going with the stadium, that's one of the big projects that he's going to have to shepherd, and I expect that his vision is a little different than Ige's on that.
Yes, and we did have the governor on the conversation today, and I asked him, where are you at with that? You don't have much time, and the stadium authority could just let the clock run out. Josh Green has said he has asked the governor to put a pause on that process, and obviously the governor is not, agreeing to do that. He's just going to keep on going. I asked if the deal was dead because UH is still saying they're going to stay at, at Ching. So we'll see what happens. So Green's camp is saying they asked the governor privately. Now they're coming out publicly and saying, please put a pause on this.
Interesting. Let's talk about the change up in Maui. You have an incumbent mayor in Victorino losing to the challenger, Richard Bisson. What do you think tipped the scales on that race? Because it's rare to see an incumbent mayor lose his seat.
It is. It's definitely very rare. And I think it wasn't entirely surprising, though, because we've kind of been seeing the signs throughout the past few months that, he was kind of in trouble. Bisson came straight out of the gate. He's one of the earliest candidates to declare he's running for mayor, quickly amassed a lot of fundraising and a lot of momentum. And then the primary indicated that he had that support. And so, Victorino's been trying to close the gap. He's been getting a lot of fundraising, still has a lot of support. But I think one of the things that really hurt his re-election chances were the pandemic. Every elected official who was in the pandemic made some really tough choices, and a lot of them were not popular. And so that was one thing that I think really was not in his favor. And Bisson has he's not a lifetime politician, but he has a lot of experience in government in the judiciary. So I think that did play in his favor as well.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point that the people who are at the helm to have to make the tough calls on closures, vaccine mandates, all of those things, Colin, they really didn't necessarily fare too well.
Well, it's interesting because I agree with what Colleen said. I think this really did hurt Mike Victorino, being the face of the COVID response on Maui. At the same time, you have to consider Josh Green, right? He was the entire state's face for COVID. After spending months inside people's living rooms, on his whiteboard explaining what was going on with COVID, he became a member of people's families. And this led to his extreme popularity. He was getting approval ratings or favorability ratings, almost in the 70s, which is unheard of. And so it seemed to work both ways. This really helped the LG. Obviously there was a minority of folks who resisted the COVID restrictions, but Josh Green, in some states in the mainland, this would have doomed you to political oblivion if you had been the one talking about the state's COVID response. And he often promoted a more aggressive response. So it I think, led to Josh Green easily becoming governor. At the same time, I think it hurt Mike Victorino. He was had one term. Half that time was, I think, consumed by the COVID response. So it seemed to go both ways.
Yeah, and tell me, what do you expect his interaction to be like with the council? We know that the council is very independently minded on Maui. You've got new faces there as well, but what do you expect that dynamic to be like with the new mayor?
That's going to be an interesting dynamic because we're actually seeing the balance of the council seems to be changing with this election. You know, a couple terms ago we had a wave of progressive candidates. They won a majority of seats on the council, and they've had time to kind of set the policy direction of the council. And in this election, I think we saw a pushback of candidates who maybe didn't like the decisions they had made, didn't like the direction they were going. I'm going to call them maybe like the moderates. And so in this election, the moderates seem to have the majority on the council now. So that could definitely change what we see going forward with the council and the relationship that they have with the mayor as well.
Blaze, let's talk a little bit about incumbents losing their seats, kind of staying on that track, and something that Colin was talking about, the Republicans gaining some seats in the House and Senate. When you look at two candidates that were obviously weakened by some scandal, we had Representative Sharon Harr and Matt Lopresti both losing their re-election bids. In the end, it seems like those allegations of DUI really were too much for voters to overcome.
I do think that played a big factor in both of those races, and it is sort of amazing that the Republican Party was able to flip 2 seats that they hadn't held previously. It's also sort of more amazing considering that they were almost down to just 2 Republicans in the House because Bob McDermott out of Eva Beach left to run for the U.S. Senate, and then Val Okimoto had to leave her seat because it was axed due to reapportionment. And so to come out with a net gain of 2 more people after those losses, it's a pretty big deal. And they also lost, that Bob McDermott district. The Senate one also was, really interesting up in the North Shore, the race between Gil Riviere and Brenton Awa. It's a really expansive region. It's the biggest on Oahu, all the way from Waialua down to Kaneohe. Gil did pretty well, I think, on this side of the Ko'olaus. He lives in Waialua, and that's pretty much what his district's been for, most of the time before reapportionment. But Brenton, since leaving the news business, he's had a pretty good ground game. He said he was going door to door. You saw his signs out there. You saw, he'd get people to do the sign waving for him. And it seems like it was a really close race. And just when we were talking earlier in the green room, I kind of looked at the precinct stats. They were really neck to neck in most places, but Brenton was able to get more in-person votes, and I think that's what sort of tipped it. It's a heavily conservative district, that one of the most conservative in the state. Yeah,
Catherine, what's your takeaway on that race? I know, in full disclosure, we worked at KITV with Brenton Awa. It's been a long time since then, but he really did, as Blaze put out there, he put in the work. You saw his social media. He was, lots of signs, lots of shoe leather, which is really what a lot of politics is all about. What do you think made the difference in that one?
I know when I was talking to Gil earlier, I guess it was around the primary time, he was saying that he was having to work very hard because his district had expanded and he had to go into Kaneohe where folks didn't know him, and Brenton lives there, and he grew up in Kahuku side, and so he has that kind of strong base. But when I talked to Gil Riviere this afternoon, he was at the state capitol, and he had said he was clearing out his office, and he had already talked to Brenton and said that he would turn over his files and help him in any way to help the district. He wasn't going to contest it, and I asked if he was interested in getting picked up by the Green administration, because they knew each other in the Senate. So we'll just have to see. He said it was very emotional because he was down there at the Capitol and people were feeling bad for him because he's served that area well for a long time, and yeah, so it was interesting.
Yeah, and stepping back from just that race to the overall wins for Republicans, what do you make of that?
Well, Jean Ward, who I talked to this afternoon, said that they actually brought the Republican winners and losers, all the candidates that they put up to run in these races down to the Capitol. And he said that he was pleased because the numbers are going back up again. He said they had, I think, 3 PhDs, 3 Hawaiians, and 2 pastors in this new group. And so he was really energized, and I think they're going to be meeting, I think, next week to try and work out the leadership aspects of who gets what committee and who wants to serve where. So, and then the Democrats, I think they met today, and I think they're still caucusing. So we'll see what happens, in the lineup, the leadership at the Capitol.
Yeah, and Colin, in terms of strategy, if the Republicans smart, they keep these candidates and they run them again.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is it's not so much running and losing the first time, it's coming back and running that second time, because now you have experience, voters in the district are beginning to know who you are, and that's what's going to be really key. So I think this was a brilliant move to say you might have struck out this time, but in some places it was very close, like in that Senate, like in Miley Shimabukuro's race. And the other thing that's going to happen, nothing succeeds like success. And so they're going to be able to recruit better quality candidates. I think that's often been where the Republican Party here has struggled. They get a lot of folks to run sometimes, but they're not people with political experience. They're not people with the kind of community connections you need to really win. But now they've shown the way. Now they've shown that if they get high quality candidates, especially on the West Side, but on the North Shore as well, they can do well. And other people are going to see that and say, running for office, which is always a huge sacrifice for yourself and your family, there's a chance we could win it, and we can start targeting some of these more vulnerable Democrats. Now, I should say, I do think they got a little lucky with Harr and Lopresti. Lopresti was, I think, relatively unpopular before, and then he got arrested of suspected DUI on top of it, Harr too. So they had a couple of good breaks, but the Britton Awa, Gil Riviere, that was just pure strategy and success. Gil Riviere was well liked. He was a former Republican before he ran as a Democrat. He's one of the most conservative Democrats in the state legislature. So I give Britton Awa a lot of credit for winning that race. And he did have, I think, the most fabulous signs of this election cycle for sure.
Colleen, we're talking about people who run and then strike out and then decide to run again. One of those folks who did that and did not fare well, of course, is Duke Aiona. What do you see as what's next for him? I mean, do you think that we're going to see him run for office again?
I guess it depends what the Republican Party looks like going forward and the candidates that they bring forward, because I think it seems like part of the reason he ran was maybe to bring a moderate experienced face to the candidates for governor. And I think we're seeing a lot of trend that in a lot of other places you mentioned, there's a lot more Republican candidates, a lot more Republican turnout. We saw that in Maui County in the primary. If you look at our numbers, the Republican turnout amongst voters was higher than it's been in a long time. And a lot of our state legislature races were contested with, Republicans, Green Party, in races that typically the Democrats would just go uncontested in. So we're definitely seeing more of that trend, but the Democrats won very easily, especially in Maui County. I mean, we had 9 Democrat lawmakers in the state to start, and we're sending back 9 Democrat lawmakers.
Yeah.
It was interesting, Angie. I got curious because I got a little thing saying that Aiona was having a rally at McKinley High School, which in my mind was always a traditional place for the Democrats to rally. And so I went to see who would show up. I was looking for Linda Lingle or, folks like that. And, he had about 350 people there, and some Democrats that I had talked to said, well, that's pretty respectable, But they were saying, oh, if you had seen that early on, but so late, you should have had 1,000 or 2,000 people this close to the actual election. But it was just really interesting to see, how he came across and the points that he was driving, with all the corruption cases. And he made some good points. And, I think, Colin, you'd mentioned before that had he maybe come out with that message and hit that harder, that he might have gotten more traction.
Yeah, who definitely hit that hard was those House candidates that ended up winning, I think. One of the examples was in District 39, where the former HSTA president, Corey Rosenlee, ran. Going up to that, I think a lot of people thought that district was locked up, but remember that was the district that Ty Cullen used to represent. Ty Cullen, along with Jay Kalani English, 2 Democrats, were charged with, accepting bribes earlier this year. I think that really helped that district in particular, and probably just Republicans in general, just harping on that message.
Yeah, Colin, expand on that.
Well, I think that the best way for Republicans to have success is to go after Democratic corruption. People, I think, don't love the Hawaii Democratic Party. They feel like they're stuck with the Hawaii Democratic Party. And when Republicans have had success, it mainly has been this message of not only being a little more business friendly, but saying, look, we're gonna govern transparently. We're not corrupt. We've only had 2 Republican governors, William Quinn and Linda Lingle. And Linda Lingle basically ran on an "I'm not corrupt" platform. I'm pragmatic. I'm not corrupt. I offer an alternative. And that's when Republicans have had success, where they try to stay out of these ideological battles that happen so frequently on the mainland. And actually, I think a lot of these Republican candidates did a pretty good job doing that. I mean, some of them are more conservative than others. I would put David Alcus, for example, the candidate who beat Matt Lopresti, on the more ideologically conservative end. But you look at Kurt Favela, for example, who ran unopposed. And I don't think of Kurt Favela as particularly, ideologically conservative at all. In fact, if I recall correctly, he was relatively supportive of the minimum wage, but he focuses on really local issues. He's really interested in transparency. So I think that, that tends to be the path to victory. Now, could Duke Aiona have really done anything differently and been more successful? I mean, I was critical of his campaign. I thought it was a little bit lackluster, but if you look at Andrea Topola, whose campaign was anything but lackluster 4 years ago, she actually didn't do that much better. Now, is Duke Aiona going to run again? First, I do think it's true that he probably ran to block BJ Penn at the end of the day. I mean, I think that's why he entered so late. That's why he didn't have the campaign infrastructure built up. Of course, he managed to do that, but it never really seemed to me like his heart was really in this race. And I always kind of had this rule of 3. You lose 3 times, and then you're kind of out. Voters have decided they're not going to support you. So I expect we're going to have a different Republican emerge. I'm not sure who that's going to be. I would be surprised if Andrea Topola is that person. I think it'll be somebody else, but I don't think it's going to be Duke Aiona again.
Given that we're talking about all these Republican successes, Colleen, I'm thinking that, yes, they've done well, but there's still only a handful in the state legislature. I mean, how much power or how much do you think they can really get done when it comes to those ideological issues, given their numbers?
That's a good question. I mean, they, as it is right now, they're going to continue to have to figure out how to compromise, how to work with the Democrats that are in power, and it's going to stay that way for a long time. So they're going to have to keep, I think, doing what they've been doing and being the minority for so long until they get some sort of real power in either of those chambers.
Blaze, let's talk about the nonpartisan races at the Honolulu City Council. We've got 3 new council members coming, Tommy Waters easily won his race. He'll stay council chair, but then we have 3 newcomers there. Tell us about what you took away from those 3 races.
Right, and one of those newcomers is another Republican. I do think, ever since Hawaii moved to the nonpartisan races, the council has sort of been where the GOP went to hide because they don't need to say that there are.
That's a good way to put it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now the council, there's, I guess, if you want to divide it along conservative, Democrat, you've got Andrea Topola, you've got Councilman Tolba, you've got Valu Kimoto and a couple others. So it'd be interesting to see, how obviously Waters kept the chair, but is Andrea gonna go for the chair herself? Can she build a coalition to get maybe, if not the chair, one of the committee seats, since there's going to be some reshuffling with Carol Fukunaga and Brandon Elefante leaving, and again, that North Shore race between Matt Wire and the surfer, McCool Rothman. Wire won, if you look at the precincts, Wire kind of won this side where he lived, and then Rothman did better in Wakawa area, but kind of surprising, whereas in the Senate race, that rural part of the North Shore really helped Brenton Awa. Matt Wire, who is sort of, I guess, the progressive in that council race, actually did better in those areas. It's really interesting.
Yeah, Catherine, what are you expecting from the council? Especially looking at, I was looking at that Okimoto Ron Minor race, given that Ron Minor is, well known in our community. He served on the council before. He's been a politician for quite some time. She's not exactly a fresh face. I mean, we know her in politics. She was at the legislature, but she's definitely, a younger voice than he is.
It's interesting, but Minor did have his issues, I think, with the DUI years ago, and so when I saw what happened with Lopresti and Harr, I just wondered, did some of that play into, the voters' memory bank? Like, oh yeah, he got into trouble, years ago. I mean, he got, elected into office, and they got past that, but I just wondered if maybe that didn't play a part of it as well.
And what about your take on that North Shore race, looking at McCool Rothman, who had the name recognition, right? Matt Wire is, I believe, a city administrator.
But I think
first-time candidate.
Right, but I think maybe people knew him, and I think he came across very well, and so yeah, that might have been it. I don't know.
And let's talk about Carol Fukunaga's seat. Her chief of staff trying to run, basically saying, I'm going to be just like my boss,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
And Tyler DeSantis-Tam, though, a well-known Democrat.
That's right. I mean, that was an incredibly crowded primary. Tracy Taguchi did well, but Tyler DeSantis-Tam was the former chair of the Hawaii Democratic Party, deeply connected to the trade unions, and so I think he was just too hard to beat. He had a ton of money, so I wasn't surprised at all that he won. I mean, he ran against Carol Fukunaga before, so he'd already established his name in that district. So not so surprising, but one thing I'll point out though is that I think if you look at some of these races, people who were office managers actually tend to do really well when they run for office because they're connected to constituents, they know the issues. So I think she did great. I mean, if you're running against the former chair of the Democratic Party and you just barely lose, I think that's a great result. For the council at large, the other interesting thing is that although we shifted these seats, there wasn't an ideological shift. So Matt Wire is a progressive. He takes Heidi Suniyoshi's seat, or more or less what was Heidi Suniyoshi's seat. These have been reapportioned, of course, who was a conservative. Tyler DeSantis-Tam is really a moderate. Carol Fukunaga was a moderate. And then you have Val Okimoto taking Brandon Elefante's seat. So here we're swapping a progressive for a conservative. But at the end of the day, the ideological balance pretty much stays the same, and which I think means Tommy Waters is going to be the chair, and I don't think you're going to see radically different policies on the council.
The ideological differences, I don't think always play that huge of a role in the council anyway. I mean, sometimes it does. We obviously saw that come out during the COVID with the mask and vaccine mandates. But on a lot of other things, the way they divide themselves up, it just depends issue by issue how they go.
I have to chuckle because I was covering City Hall when they made that switch. It used to be, Republicans and Democrats, and when the three city council members switched parties midterm, and Patsy Mink went out there and said, "This is wrong," and had them recalled, and then after that, it was a nonpartisan race. So. Thank you, Patsy, because I think you're talking sewers and roads and,
right.
Yeah.
Your trash, and I think that was good.
Right, and Blaze does bring up a great point that this is a place where Republicans can win, right, in a way that they don't necessarily win in these broad numbers at the legislature.
There's something that's terrible about having that R next to your name. But if you don't have the R, if you're running a nonpartisan race, you can do okay. I mean, look at our mayor, right? Mayor Blangiardi is a conservative. He admitted that he voted for Donald Trump, which was very controversial when he was running. Yet he's, I think, a pretty popular mayor. So when you're in those nonpartisan races, you can do okay, as long, I think, as you don't have a previous record of being a partisan politician. That can make your life a little bit difficult, but Blangiardi didn't have that, of course.
That's a good point because, we were talking earlier about how Bisson, he used to be in the Lingle administration, right? And she was a Republican governor. And so throughout his campaign, he's been having to kind of push off this notion that, are you a Republican or you're a conservative? And if this had been a partisan race and he ran as a Republican, I don't think he would have won. But he really emphasized, look, I've been voting since I was 18 and I haven't voted in any political party, so it didn't play as big of a factor as it might have if it were a partisan race.
That is so interesting. I want to stick with you for, as we pivot to the statewide races. No surprise, of course, Senator Schatz keeping his seat along with Ed Case, but Hawaii does have a new member of the congressional delegation, CD2, which is, of course, Maui County falls in that. What do you think about Jill Takuda'S race and what kind of a congressperson you're expecting her to be?
Definitely. I think it's really going to help that she has that state level experience, right? And that's, as a legislator and taking that to Congress. So of course, it's a totally different game and a totally different dynamic, right? Because here in the state, you've got the power, right? You're the Democrats, and going to Congress, I think she's going to really have to learn to adapt and work with that changing political lines that we're seeing in Congress. And it really helps that she already has, several experienced Democrats to work with when she gets over to Washington, and so we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, Mazie Hirono calls her political daughter, so it's no secret that she has a mentor right there in Washington.
Yeah, she'll fit in.
Catherine?
She'll fit in just fine. I mean, I know she worked really hard. It was really tough during the primary when she was a target of the super PACs, for both she and Sylvia. But she worked, very hard. I know she was just going. I think she told me one morning she took the ferry from Maui to Lanai to go work the crowd, in Lanai. So she did really try and work that during the general. But, going back to the primary and all the negative ads that we saw, I know one question that was brought up was, how's that going to work? Because the super PAC that supported Josh Green, worked very hard to defeat Sylvia Luke. And is there going to be some, strife going forward in the administration, when the unions want something? I don't know.
That's an interesting
something to
take.
watch.
And also thinking about going back to CD2, Blaze, what do you think about how Jill Takuda and how long she could stay there? Because there's been a lot of question. Patrick Bronco tried to make that an issue to say that if I get the seat, I'm a lifer. I'm not going to try to run for another office. And of course, there are rumblings. She hasn't even been sworn in yet, but we're already thinking she's going to perhaps run for the Senate. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was going to say that, we brought up how she's Mazie Hirono's political daughter. She'll be in that, I think she'll be in that congressional seat for as long as Mazie Hirono is a senator. And, I do think that she's, obviously being groomed to eventually take over that Senate seat. Though that still means she's, I guess, in office in a way. So she may be a lifer too, perhaps.
In a different way. What do you think of that CD2 seat? We've seen, of course,
Right.
Tulsi Gabbard, Kaikahele, and now we have Jill Takuda in there.
Well, we've had so much volatility in that seat, which is unusual for our congressional delegation, which usually tends to be extremely stable. I agree with what Blaze says. I think that Jill Takuda will be in Congress as long as she gets reelected, and I think she would go to the Senate if she has a chance. I think that this debate, are you going to stay in Congress forever, is really silly. As a state, we want the best and most experienced people in the Senate. That is the most powerful position. We have 2 senators. We're a tiny state, and we get 2 senators. We want the best people in those seats. So, if she gets an opportunity to run for Senate, I hope she does. But I do think that she is going to stay in that seat and do the work. Everything I know about Jill Takuda is that she is a detail-oriented legislator, right? She was sort of famous for loving to talk about the details of the state budget. She's someone you can go up and ask, because I have, Jill, could you explain to me how the CIP project works? And she'll say, oh Colin, I'll tell you. How much time do you have? She's someone who enjoys those details of legislation. I don't think she's that interested in creating a national media presence for herself, which seemed to be something that Tulsi Gabbard was very interested in. I think she wants to stay in Washington. I don't think we can expect her to try to come back to Hawaii and run for governor like Kaikahele. So she's going to be there for a long time. I think she's wanted this job for a long time. And I think she's going to be really effective. I think very highly of Jill Takuda.
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting, because watching her as the money chair at the Senate and then getting the boot, I think because of her vote, on rail, it just was really interesting to see her kind of recover, and then when she was debating about jumping into the lieutenant governor's race, and then she had to make a strategic move, and then was able to, land where she did in CD2. It's been fascinating to kind of watch her kind of pick herself up.
Yeah, let's not forget that she did start this race running for LG, and then Blaze switched over and decided that once she saw Kaikahele exit, that this was her moment.
Yeah, that seems like a lifetime ago.
It really does.
Ran for LG. It's the Kai thing, and I think, that sort of started the dominoes with her getting out. That meant Sylvia Luke had a chance to get in, and she ended up winning. It is sort of fascinating, the interplay. And those two, also had a relationship in the legislature when they were both chairs of the money committees.
Yeah, and when we think about Jill Takuda, one thing that I found interesting today, I was looking on Twitter, I'm checking all these House races on the mainland to see what the balance of powers is going to be. But I also saw a lot of really prominent, mostly female lawmakers in Washington already tweeting out their congratulations, trying to embrace her, bring her into the sort of more, liberal fold of the party. I expect her to be a champion for women's issues. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, especially what we're seeing with, Roe v. Wade and all the kinds of issues that are happening with the courts right now, I think a lot of the, Democratic lawmakers are really having to, stand their ground and maybe push a little bit more to the left. They're really having to defend some of those rights and make sure, hey, this is what I stand for in the face of some of the things that are happening with the court system. And we're also seeing too, trickle down to our state legislature. There were some of the candidates that got elected in Maui County districts for state races, I see them as more progressive Democrats. One of them talked about, I'm going to push back against the oppressive Republican agenda. That's what she said. So that's on the mind, both on the state level and the congressional level. So Jill Takuda, I'm sure, is going to, have to make that sort of stance too.
Yeah, Colin, what do you think the priorities will be here on the state level when it comes to the legislature? We have, reapportionment meant that we had a lot of sort of people moving around, but for the most part, we know a lot of these players. What do you expect them to take on?
Well, if I could talk for 1 second about what Jill Takuda is going to do in D.C., I think that I agree with what Colleen said, but I think she's a pragmatist, so I don't think we can expect her to join the squad or the real left-leaning parts of Congress. I think she really is interested in reaching across the aisle and getting things done. So everything I know about Jill Takuda tells me that she's probably going to be a pretty mainstream Democrat. But in terms of what the state legislature is going to do, they're going to have to work with the governor to solve this stadium problem. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to think through the green fee. That was one of the only concrete legislative proposals that we heard from Josh Green when he was running for governor. And this is the idea that somehow we would tax tourists when they arrive on the island. This is something that's quite popular, but it might be unconstitutional. There has been some pushback already, from what I understand, from the tourism committee chairs. So how they're going to navigate that is going to be interesting. What I think is going to happen with this session is they're going to try to see how much they can push back against the agenda. I mean, the American political system is set up where the legislature and the governor are supposed to be rivals. And we know that there's something that happens when you move to that fifth floor office. You might have thought you had friends in the legislature. Mm-hmm. I know David Ige did. And then when you get up there, all of a sudden those friends are not returning your calls anymore. And so Governor-elect Green is going to have a very short honeymoon, and I think the legislative leadership is going to begin to figure out how much they have to work with him, how much they can push back. And so I think that's really going to be the theme. They're not going to give any ground. That's not how they work. We have a pretty disciplined legislature that the leadership isn't necessarily known as being Green allies if Scott Saiki, for example, stays as Speaker, which I expect he will. So that's how I see the political themes. And then all the usual policy issues around affordable housing, pre-K education. But I think a lot of this is going to be them feeling each other out and trying to see how much can Josh Green use his public popularity and public support to push back. Because one thing that Green is good at, and David Ige was not good at, is using the bully pulpit. So I think you're going to see a lot more efforts by Green to shape public opinion and use that to push the legislature to embrace his agenda. The legislative leadership hasn't had to deal with that since Neil Abercrombie, so we'll see how they manage a much more aggressive governor who's not afraid to get out in public and to criticize them pretty actively.
But Blaze, isn't that where Sylvia would then come in as your key asset if you're Governor Green? That at least you can try to leverage her relationships to make that a little bit easier in that negotiation process.
Yeah, definitely. I think she'd be the backdoor negotiator, handling things behind the scenes while the governor comes out with a big stick and starts whacking them over the head in public over, when they don't push his policy agenda. But I do think we'll probably see it on both fronts with him, putting pressure on the public to, push these things and push their lawmakers to do it. And Sylvia trying to shepherd the bills through the legislature, going committee by committee and trying to, make sure things stay intact. I think the first clue we'll get about how they're really faring with the legislature will probably be with, the Senate when they go to do their the appointments to all the director positions. That's, I think, what the administration is going to spend a lot of time doing in this very first session that they have, is just trying to get the cabinet filled.
Yeah. And what I heard too is the Democrats were caucusing today. Who's going to be the new money chair? Who's going to be the new Sylvia Luke? And then see how that person then works with. And
what that person's relationship.
Right.
I mean, this administration's got a lot on their plate. They have Red Hill, they have the stadium that we've talked about.
They have the prison.
They have the prison. They also have TMT. I mean, let's not forget that is going to be part of the conversation. If you're looking, as for the public, where do they think, Colin talked about needing some early wins. Where do you think they get them?
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, they're all really tough issues. Colin, what's your take?
Well, I mean, an early win for the governor has to be the stadium, has to be to solve that problem. I think that they can make an early win working some compromise out around this green fee. That's going to be a very delicate legal issue, but there's a lot of public support, and I think folks do want that. So that could be an early win. I'd love to see an early win. I think it would be in the interest of the legislature and the governor for something around pre-K education too. That's been kicking around for years and years and years. And the governor in particular needs one of these more than the legislature. So that's where I think the political dynamics are going to come into play. The legislature can continue to push back. It costs them much less than it does for the governor because he doesn't have a lot of time. And then if he doesn't succeed early on, folks are going to say, oh, well, it's just business as usual, gridlock. Green can't get anything done more than EGAY. So that's why I think that this green fee issue is going to end up being, because that was a central, one of the few concrete legislative proposals that he kept talking about during the campaign. And it's a very clear proposal. He can say, this was mine and I delivered it. It wouldn't surprise me if that's what they focus on trying to push through the legislature in the first session.
But as you mentioned, that could be unconstitutional. When asked, Governor Ige has said that there's no mechanism to do that because you can't collect monies at an airport that is not designated then for an airport. So how do you do it? Do you chase down tourists at their hotel, or where do you actually gather the funds? So that'll be interesting to figure out how they do that. But the green fee speaks to another issue that the pandemic really highlighted, particularly in Maui County, and that is the tourism impact. So if you think about perhaps the green fee is something to pursue, because at least people, especially in the county that you write in, would feel like that they'd have a win, right? They'd have a voice.
Yeah, and it depends too, because I think the neighbor island counties and the voters have seen so many times the funding get funneled to Oahu instead of to neighbor island causes. And so the first question they're going to be like is, how does this benefit us? Are we going to see the money? Because, we saw what happened with the TAT recently, right? Each of the counties, the shares that they contributed were taken away, given to the state, and the state said, okay, you guys in the counties, you can make your own TAT, which we did in Maui County. But I think there's some frustration at the county level that there's all these fees levied, and a lot of it comes from Maui County's very popular tourism industry, right? Oahu far surpasses anybody else, of course, but Maui County is probably second in terms of visitors we're seeing and tourism revenue, and so, especially after the pandemic. And so they're going to want to know, where's that money going? Are we going to see it? Are we going to benefit from that?
Yeah, Blaze, what do you think that the legislature prioritizes? I mean, we talked briefly about also women's rights. We know that abortion is part of the Hawaii state constitution, so it's a protected right here in Hawaii. But there have been talks about making it even stronger. Do you expect them to take that on?
I think the legislature will need to do, something in those areas, especially since we've been seeing, other states pass some laws to try to target people that cross state lines. So that would be one thing they do. But the broader policy agenda, we talked about what the new governor is going to want to do, but the legislature always has its own things that its own committee chairs come up with that they want to push for. And it's almost never in line with what the governor wants. And sometimes what the Senate and House want don't align either. And it's going to, again, try to tackle some of those things that we talk about every year. It's about housing, it's about homelessness, it's about food security. One place where they will align, though, I think, probably is that K-12 issue that's been bandied about, and how to get more classrooms open.
They have to build the housing. They just have to. The governor said that, he just met with William Ila over at the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and we'll see who takes his place or if he's retained by Green. But Governor Ige said that they're looking at, different ways to spend that money that they just appropriated to help Native Hawaiians get on some land. And he's talking about all kinds of things from, leasing, an acre plot for sustainable agriculture as opposed to commercial agriculture. But, they really, really have to get housing out to the people. I mean, we've been waiting so long, and it's just been, we watched the Mayor Wright housing project fall apart. And we're watching rail take shape, and we're hearing about all these proposals that are coming up from Waipahu to Mo'ili'ili, and you're saying, okay, well, where's the rail route? Where's the TOD? And are we going to keep to that line, or are we just going to branch out? where we can.
You know, one other thing that I wanted to mention that I'm not sure if they're going to make a priority, but it'll be interesting to see how they handle it, are all the anti-corruption measures. There was this commission of very distinguished citizens who have proposed these various measures that would reduce corruption. Voters haven't forgotten about this. It really didn't get a whole lot of attention in the general election. I mean, of course, the Republicans did talk about it. But my sense is usually the legislature doesn't like to deal directly with those issues. And so whether they embrace some of them or kind of gingerly walk around them and let them die in committee will be interesting to see. And it'll be interesting to see if the Green administration supports them or kind of lets them go away as good ideas, well-meaning good ideas, but not something they're really going to get behind and push.
Yeah, I mean, Colleen, they were talking about term limits. They were talking about not being able to fundraise during the legislative session there. You know, some of those restrictions maybe hurt the incumbent, and so they're probably not that excited to take that on.
Yeah, that's partially part of, you know, I don't think the corruption played as big as a role in this election as it possibly could have, because we had some really big scandals recently, you know, involving lawmakers. And I think we did see some of it play a role in one of the charter amendments that we had in Maui County, where it was to require public officials to provide financial disclosures and to not, you know, be involved in certain issues that they have a direct interest in, and that overwhelmingly passed. And I think people are probably thinking about these scandals that we've seen and these bribery issues when they're voting for that kind of issue.
Yeah,
Can I ask, why did Maui County have so many charters?
That's a great question.
Yeah, you know, it's that's what we were all asking ourselves as we looked at our ballots. We cover it regularly, and even for us, it was a lot. But it's this thing that happens every 10 years, right? Our charter commission meets this group of citizens, and they go through the whole charter and say, okay, what are the ways that we can update it? So there's usually a handful of charter amendments that people can stomach every election, but this was overwhelming because it was an overview of the entire charter. Yeah, that's done every decade.
Well, and that might have turned people off to voting. I mean, if we go back to where we started, you know, we have about 5 minutes left, but talking about the low voter turnout, Maui County had the lowest voter turnout. Perhaps some people opened those ballots and said, I don't know, I'm just going to put this in the recycling. I mean,
it's very possible, which is a shame because there were some really big, important proposals on this ballot. You know, one to create a separate housing department, one to create an OEV resources department and make our government bilingual. And then a biggest one was about this proposal to create these community water authorities that oversee water operations in Maui County, and possibly having us pursue the leases that the state is currently, you know, giving out to the into like East Maui Irrigation that controls the huge irrigation system that used to feed the sugar plantation. So these big proposals, I think, kind of got a little lost in all these other amendments.
Yeah, Catherine, what's your take on why the turnout was so low and what we could do to get people to participate? Because we make it so easy, or not we, but the state makes it so easy. They send it to your house. How much easier could it be?
Yeah, and it is very sad, you know, when you have this distrust of the system, and that's the one thing, our election system is, you know, that's our democracy, right? I mean, you get out there and you vote, and you know, whether you bounce the incumbents, I mean, that's just the process. But it is sad. I don't know what it's going to take to get more people to check that box and drop it off or mail it.
Yeah, Blaze, what's your take on that?
I think you need people to get, I think the government needs to get people to trust the government again.
Yeah.
You know, that trust in government, I think, plays a huge role in participation in democracy. And for a lot of people, I think if they don't see how they could change anything with their one vote, then they might not decide to vote at all. And that sort of, you know, snowballs the problem into a bunch of people not voting and then nothing changing because nobody's voting.
Yeah, I mean, given his popularity, you know, was Josh Green a candidate that people were excited about, or did they just feel comfortable that he was going to win anyway, so why bother? What do you take away from that? Because, you know, as you noted earlier, he had very high approval ratings. He's done very well. He raised a lot of money, won the primary handily. So what happened?
I think it was comfort. I mean, people have often said that Josh Green's support was wide, but it wasn't all that deep. And I think that's probably true, which is why I think that he won't have a very long honeymoon. I think they did like his experience during COVID, but they don't have a strong and emotional connection with him than perhaps some candidates in the past, which is why I think he needs to get some early wins. In terms of voter turnout, I think we can't make it any easier, but we can make it more exciting, and that means more competitive races. And how might you do that? My favorite proposal is to revisit how we publicly finance campaigns. And there's a lot of fun ways you can do that that I think would lead to many more challengers, which will lead to a more robust democracy.
But given that the people who would make those rules
Well, that's
are the
the problem.
incumbents,
That's always
right?
the problem.
Right. And going back to some of the corruption, anti-corruption measures that you brought up, do you think that any of those will actually be taken up in earnest?
Well, I know term limits will not. That's one I'm pretty sure will not. The others, I'm not sure. I actually don't expect any of them to pass. I don't think the legislature has much interest in passing them, and I think they're going to look at them, but I think they're all going to end up not quite making their way through the committees.
We've got the inauguration coming up. Blaze, what are you looking to hear from Josh Green in that speech?
Well, I think what the rest of the state wants to hear, we, heard what he said on the campaign trail, and we heard a lot of the promises. I think the public wants specifics now on how exactly is he going to execute this agenda. How are you going to build 10,000 more homes? How are you going to manage to get this green fee that we've been talking about? How are you going to get more pre-K classrooms? That's things that we, the public, and also the lawmakers, I think, are going to expect to hear.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Of course, we do thank our guests, Catherine Cruz from Hawaii Public Radio and Blaze Lovell of Honolulu Civil Beat. From the Maui News, Colleen Uechi, and political analyst Colin Moore. Next week, right here on Insights, rat lungworm disease. You may have heard about this parasite often hidden in unwashed produce. Now there's some new research about where else it could be hiding. We're going to tell you all about that next Thursday. Please do join us then. I'm Yanji Denise for Insights on PBS Hawaii. Aloha.